James nearly lost Elena that night. He held her close, comforting her, promising that no one would ever hurt her again. He insisted that she stay at his place that night. Seeing Elena so battered and bruised, James was filled with heartache. He gently cleaned her wounds, his hands moving with careful tenderness. Meanwhile, Helen finally learned the truth, that James's rumored girlfriend was none other than Elena. To make matters worse, her scandal with the scumbag had been exposed all over the internet, fueling her fury. The next morning, James lovingly prepared breakfast for Elena, but she couldn't shake the memory of how he had threatened the scumbag the night before. She mistakenly believed that James's protection was only because he saw their relationship as nothing more than a fling, and that he viewed her as someone who belonged to him, not to be tainted by anyone else. With this in mind, Elena decided to leave. However, James wanted her to stay, and her decision to go angered him, leading to an argument, and they parted on bad terms. At James's father's birthday banquet, Elena's arrival stunned the entire crowd, all eyes turning to her. She was just about to present her gift when Helen suddenly appeared and smacked the present out of her hands, causing a stir among the guests. Without hesitation, Helen publicly revealed that Elena was James's rumored girlfriend, leaving Elena in an awkward position. But James arrived just in time, standing firmly by Elena's side. He boldly stated that his marriage to Helen had long been over in all but name, and he accused Helen of infidelity, declaring his right to choose his own partner. James's father, clearly pleased with Elena, had grown tired of Helen's antics. He immediately ordered the security guards to remove her from the party. At that moment, Elena received a phone call from her mother and rushed to the hospital. Thankfully, her mother was all right. It turned out that her mother had seen the news about Elena and James, as well as the scandal with the scumbag. Her mother offered her full support for whatever decisions Elena chose to make and reassured her not to worry. Her mother then revealed something shocking. Elena's father had once done a great favor for James's family, which explained why James's father was so fond of her. This revelation left Elena feeling even more conflicted about her emotions toward James. When Elena returned to James's mansion, she hugged him gratefully and thanked him for all the help he had given her. Feeling uncertain, she asked, "Are you helping me because of my father?" James, pretending to be evasive, simply replied, "Yes." Then, without another word, he pulled her into a tight embrace and kissed her deeply, the emotions between them spilling over. They spent a passionate night together. Meanwhile, news of Helen's outburst at the birthday party had reached her family, and she was severely punished, ultimately being disowned by the family. Seething with rage, Helen vowed to take revenge on Elena. The next morning, as Elena watched James sleep, her heart raced uncontrollably. She slipped away to freshen up, but James quietly sneaked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her as he playfully leaned into her. Feeling confused, Elena couldn't help but ask, "What are we now?" James froze for a moment, seemingly caught off guard by the question, as if searching for the right answer. Perhaps afraid of hearing something disappointing, Elena answered for him, "We're adults, just having fun, right?" With that, she turned and walked away. After she left, James murmured softly, "No. You're my girlfriend." When Elena met up with her best friend, the friend was shocked to learn about her budding romance with James. She warned Elena to be careful of James' first girlfriend, Doris. Doris and James had dated for 4 years, but they broke up when Doris left to pursue her ballet career abroad. Rumor had it that James's marriage to Helen was nothing more than an attempt to get back at Doris. That evening, Elena received an invitation from James for a candlelit dinner. She accepted and arrived to a romantic setup. James fed her a bite of food, and the atmosphere was warm and intimate. Unable to hold back, Elena asked, "Do you like me?" But instead of answering directly, James smiled and said, "The steak is delicious, and so are you." His vague response left Elena feeling a bit disappointed. She realized she shouldn't have expected a clear answer. The next morning, to thank James for helping her mother transfer hospitals, Elena decided to cook breakfast. The morning could have been perfect, but it was interrupted by a phone call. Elena noticed the name Doris on James's screen. Their plans to head to work together were cancelled, and James left the table. Curious, Elena scrolled through social media and found posts about Doris's return. She was back in the country, nursing a leg injury. Meanwhile, Doris was watching a news video about James and Elena, her heart burning with jealousy. Her sole reason for returning to the country was to get back with James. When James arrived at her house, Doris played the victim, crying pitifully and even clinging to him in an attempt to win him back. However, James wasn't falling for it. He saw through Doris's act, knowing that she was only back because she cared about his power and status. He prepared to leave, but out of some lingering sympathy for his ex, he helped her arrange treatment with the best doctors for her leg injury. Back at home, Elena waited for James until late at night, growing increasingly worried. She decided to call him, but to her shock, it was Doris who answered. Heartbroken, Elena quietly packed her bags, deciding it was time to leave James for good. James, furious that Doris had answered his phone, told her that they would no longer see each other. But when he returned home, he found the house empty. Elena was gone. Elena moved in with her best friend and cut off all contact with James, determined to sever their complicated relationship once and for all. The next day, Elena went to visit her mother, only to find her best friend, John, keeping her company. John had always been like a little brother to Elena, though in truth, he had harbored feelings for her for years. The two chatted happily, and as John left, he lightly patted her on the head, a moment that James witnessed as he arrived. Overcome with jealousy, James immediately confronted Elena, demanding, "Is that your new boyfriend?" Elena responded coolly, "He's just like a brother." Her words calmed James slightly, but he still complained, "I haven't been able to sleep properly without you around." Elena mentioned her concerns about Doris and James's relationship, admitting that it bothered her. James, finding her jealousy adorable, offered no explanation. Instead, he pulled her into a kiss. The kiss deepened, the tension rising between them, and it seemed their relationship was about to cross a new threshold. But suddenly, James's phone rang. It was Doris. The call shattered the moment. Furious, Elena slapped James across the face and stormed off. James angrily scolded Doris for her untimely call before hanging up, while, miles away, Doris stood fuming. By her side were Helen and the scumbag fiancé. As it turned out, the three of them had already formed an alliance, plotting together to take down Elena. A few days later, Doris, pretending to be a business partner, tricked James into meeting her at a restaurant under the guise of celebrating her birthday. Unexpectedly, they ran into John and Elena having dinner together. Unwilling to let it slide, James approached and began to provoke John. Not one to be outdone, Doris joined in, using a flirty tone to call James by his pet name, deliberately trying to unsettle Elena. This embarrassing scene ended with John calmly taking Elena's hand and leading her out of the restaurant, leaving James fuming as he, too, stormed out. Furious, Doris covertly informed her co-conspirators, "Tonight's the night." Later that evening, after John had dropped Elena off at her apartment and made sure she was safe, he left. But just as he departed, disaster struck. Elena was kidnapped. She woke up in an abandoned pool, facing the scumbag and Helen, who blamed all their failures and suffering on her. They subjected Elena to brutal torture, and she quickly realized that Doris had orchestrated the entire kidnapping. Meanwhile, Elena's best friend noticed she couldn't reach her and grew increasingly anxious. She immediately contacted John and James. Knowing Elena couldn't swim, the scumbag, after torturing her, cruelly pushed her into the deep pool. Elena struggled desperately in the water, her vision fading as she began to lose consciousness. In those last moments, James's face flashed in her mind. Just as she was on the verge of giving up, James appeared, diving into the pool to save her. Once back on land, James ordered his men to take care of the scumbag and Helen, showing them no mercy whatsoever. At that moment, John arrived. Seeing him, James handed the unconscious Elena over, believing she wouldn't want to see him right now. He asked John to look after her and requested that John keep the truth of the rescue a secret, letting her believe it was John who had saved her. When Elena woke up in the hospital, John, not wanting to take credit for something he hadn't done, told her the truth. However, Elena's misunderstandings about James ran deep. She believed James had only saved her because he didn't want Doris to be burdened with a death on her conscience. John recalled the intensity with which James had rescued her, but chose to remain silent. Outside the room, James overheard everything. Feeling defeated, he stood quietly as John advised him not to appear in front of Elena again and to move on with Doris. But James simply replied, "The one in my heart isn't Doris," and walked away. Doris, upon learning that the kidnapping had failed, flew into a rage. Before she could act further, she was informed that James had ordered her to be thrown out of the hospital. When she found out that James had personally risked the water, his greatest fear, to save Elena, her frustration reached new heights. At that very moment, James confronted Doris. No longer holding back, he coldly ordered her to leave the city, warning her that if she didn't, she would experience what true hell looked like. Afterward, James visited Elena in the hospital, determined to clear up the misunderstandings caused by Doris. Elena chose to believe him, and the two finally reconciled. James gently fed her water, and the atmosphere between them became increasingly warm and intimate. But just as the moment was growing more tender, Elena's best friend suddenly arrived, instantly making the situation awkward. Elena's best friend, fresh from hearing the latest gossip, shared a surprising revelation. James's mother had tragically drowned, and ever since, James had harbored a deep fear of water. Despite this lifelong phobia, he had broken through that barrier to save Elena. Hearing this, Elena's feelings toward James became even more complicated. After being discharged from the hospital, James's father invited Elena to dinner, mainly to check on her safety and well-being. After dinner, James offered to take Elena home, but instead of her place, he drove her back to his mansion. When Elena tried to leave, James quickly scooped her up and carried her inside. Seeing her scars filled James with guilt. In a low voice, he apologized, "This is all my fault. You suffered because of me." Since her wounds couldn't get wet, he tenderly picked her up, intending to help her bathe, but Elena stopped him. They were now standing close, the atmosphere thick with tension. James couldn't hold back any longer and leaned in to kiss her deeply. After their kiss, Elena's resistance slowly melted away as their emotions intertwined. That night, the two finally put all their misunderstandings and barriers behind them, spending a beautiful, intimate evening together. The next morning, Elena insisted on returning to her best friend's house. James, unwilling to let her go, held her tightly, playfully trying to convince her to stay. But despite his efforts, Elena was resolute, and James had no choice but to take her back. When they arrived, John and Elena's best friend were already waiting to pick her up. Seeing John, James, ever the jealous rival, couldn't resist subtly provoking him, tossing out thinly veiled jabs. Later that day, John invited Elena to dinner. In the warm, cozy atmosphere, he finally gathered the courage to confess his feelings. He admitted that he no longer wanted to be just the little brother and wanted to be her boyfriend instead. However, Elena didn't accept his confession. After returning home, Elena barely made it through the door before James pounced on her, pinning her to the sofa. His heart was racing, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing her any longer. Desperate and emotional, he finally confessed his true feelings. Holding her close, he pleaded, "Give me a title, please.